an important day. We are celebrating the centennial of the 19th Amendment. 100 years ago today, wasn't a Tuesday, it was a Wednesday, I looked that up. Tennessee became the 36th state to ratify the 19th Amendment. It had been passed by Congress more than a year earlier on June the 4th, 1919, but it took that long for 36 states to finally ratify it. And the 19th Amendment, as you probably know, granted women the right to vote. And we have three distinguished panelists today, whom I will introduce in just a moment, who will provide us with an overview of the suffrage movement, its history, its reception in the German-American community, and also explore some early German-American women's rights advocates like Matilda Franziska Anneke. And afterwards, there will be an opportunity for questions. As I said earlier, if you don't feel comfortable asking a question in front of the camera, you can send me a message via the chat function, and I'll be happy to ask that question on your behalf. So let me introduce my panelists. I will do this in alphabetical order, and I'd like to start with Dr. Alison Efford. Alison, can you just say hello real quick so we can see you? She is an historian of immigration and the 19th century United States at Marquette University in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And she teaches US history and upper division courses on immigration, the Gilded Age, and the Progressive Era. As you will undoubtedly notice when you hear her speak, she is a native New Zealander, and that brings a unique perspective to the classroom. In 2013, she published a book entitled German Immigrants, Race and Citizenship in the Civil War Era. And she is also an author of several essays and articles that have appeared in a number of journals. She is currently working on a very exciting project, a collaboration with Victoria Bilic from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee on a collection of Civil War era letters by the important German-American abolitionist and suffragist Matilda Franziska Anneke, of whom we will hear more later. My next panelist is Miss Kade Howard. She is an international development consultant whose clients include US government and UN agencies, not-for-profits, and also private sector companies. Her advocacy work inspired her interest in the history of the women's suffrage movement. She began her career on Capitol Hill as a Senate legislative and committee staff member, and also held appointments in the Clinton administration at the Departments of State and Agriculture. Her work has led her to travel all over the place, including to Africa, the Balkans, the Caribbean, as well as Central and South Asia. And last but not least is Dr. Mark Louden, also from Wisconsin, from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and he is the Alfred L. Shoemaker, J. William Frey, and Don Yoder Professor of German Linguistics, and the director of the Max Kade Institute for German American Studies at the UW-Madison. Most of his research and public outreach is centered on the Pennsylvania Dutch. And that is, of course, a population in Pennsylvania, but it's also a language and varieties of German spoken in Europe and North America, and interestingly enough, Yiddish, which is a derivative of German as well. Apart from his teaching and his research, he serves as an interpreter and cultural mediator for Amish and Old Order Mennonite groups in the legal and healthcare systems. So let's give a virtual round of applause to our wonderful distinguished panelists. Kade, I would very much like to start with you. Could you please give us an overview of the history of the suffrage movement, the early years? It really took off around the middle of the 19th century, and there was a lot going on during that time. It was an era of enormous social changes. In the US, there was a lot of immigration from European countries. But if you could just give us an idea, what happened around 1850, in the late 1840s and around 1850, that inspired this suffrage movement that gave rise to the desire for women to have political participation?
Sure, I'd be happy to, and thank you very much. I'd like to premise my opening remarks and actually the entire session with, if I could ask, you can indulge me, Katja, I'd like to ask everybody two questions, not to answer, but to think about. The first question on this is, with the history, is, did you learn about this in school? Either where you grew up in the country, if you grew up in another country, or did you, about women's suffrage in your own country, or did you learn about it in the US? And do you remember taking any classes or hearing about it? And the second question I'm going to ask is, and again, I don't want answers, I just want you to think about it. On your bookshelves in your libraries, who are the authors of your books? And what do you imagine that they look like? So are they all men? Are they women? Are they people of color? Who provides your history? And that's really the overview for where you start looking at the history of women's rights in this country. And Katja is actually right. It's actually very correct. It starts where what we're taught starts around 1848 with the Seneca Falls Convention in New York. It actually, if you go back and look at the timelines, and I'm not an expert on this, but it'll go back as early as the 1600s in the Maryland colony, where at least one woman, an unmarried woman with property and serving as a lawyer for Lord Baltimore, attempted to vote and was denied in the Maryland Colonial Assembly. And then you have, throughout the 1700s, you have bits and snippets. And remember, they're not recording the history. Women aren't writing history, but you get bits and snippets of incidents where you see women attempting suffrage. The New Jersey Constitution of 1776 is adopted. It allowed residents who owned a specific amount of property to vote without reference to race or gender. And you cannot discuss suffrage with women's suffrage without race. And then Lydia Taft, a recent widow in 1756, attempted to vote, as she's allowed to vote as her husband's proxy at a town meeting on the French and Indian Wars. So you have, and then of course we all know the very famous Abigail Adams quote in the letters to her husband, "Remember the ladies." Well, she's writing him that because while he's busy off forming a country, she's home managing the estate. And he would leave her for months on a time with a farm up in Massachusetts to manage. And but for her managing that farm and raising all those kids, he would not have been able to have done what he did as a founding father, nor represented the US for money in France and in England. Or not in England, obviously, more money. But that, I mean, this whole point is that this is an underlying theme. But it's always very underneath the ground. It's not up in front because women didn't take public positions. We didn't protest in the streets. We didn't go to public speaking events. We didn't speak in public. And so around the 1830s, you have Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and she's growing up in upstate New York, not in Seneca Falls at the time. I think so, I'm not sure. I have to double check that, sorry. And her father is a distinguished lawyer. And she is distressed by the fact that she's not a son. And her father is a lawyer who doesn't have anybody to take over because there's been deaths in the family and their children. And she is upset with what's happening when she's reading in the law about how women have no standing. They don't own property. And if they marry, they lose all rights to their property. Everything becomes their husband's, whether it's a piece of jewelry or whether it's their clothing, it all belongs to their husband. And so there's one famous story where she attempts to solve the issues of the fact that women have no rights by cutting out the passages in the case books of her father. Now think about this, because think how valuable books were in the 19th century. And she doesn't get in trouble for it. Her father just basically just says, he just basically gives her a hug and says, "I wish I could help." So they did all sorts of legal machinations to try to protect, if you were lucky, and you came from a family with money, and you had a father who cared about you, you would have someone who would try to do legal machinations around the fact that you didn't have legal standing. And they would do creative trusts and all sorts of legal maneuvers in order to protect you when you went from your father's possession to your husband's possession. But that meant the majority of women didn't have those protections because that was only for the very few. So she grows up with this, and she's reading her father's law books, and she's working alongside of her father, and she's in a very unique upbringing. As a young woman, she marries a Henry Stanton, and on her honeymoon, she goes with Lucretia Mott she meets Lucretia Mott as she and her husband leave to go to London for the 1940 Abolitionist Convention. And Lucretia Mott is leading the Pennsylvania delegation. Lucretia Mott is in her 40s. She's a Quaker, and she meets young Elizabeth Cady Stanton, 25. It's 1840, and they are denied the right at this Quaker convention, this convention, to speak or to be on the floor. And they fight to be allowed to do it, and they're not allowed. And so they end up basically leaving their husbands, enjoying London, and having long conversations, and they resolve that they will hold a convention on women's rights. They come back to the States, life intervenes, 8 years pass. But there's still this interaction because New York, upstate New York, is this hub of activity. And one of the things that strikes me when I've done the reading on this is how much travel and interaction there is between Boston and Philadelphia and Seneca Falls and Waterloo. And they're connected by family, and they're connected by the churches. Elizabeth Cady Stanton is not a Quaker, but Lucretia Mott is. And they're very activists. They're activists in the abolition movement. The families in the area in this part of New York are running the equivalent of free trade, slave-free trade stores. Our equivalent, modern equivalent, would be free trade. Fair trade, not free trade. And they have all this interaction going on. So Lucretia Mott and Martha Wright are visiting in upstate New York. This is about 1848. And they also are getting together with Jane McClintock and Jane Hunt and Anne McClintock. These are all families that are in the area, but it's not close. I mean, I did the tour up there. It's miles apart. And think about this, we don't have a car. Even with the car, I was running back and forth between cities to visit these sites. And Harriet Tubman has a place up there. And there's all this activity that we don't even think about. And they decide to get together for tea at Jane Hunt's house. And it was for a very practical reason. Jane Hunt had just had a baby. And so of the women in this group who are all connected, the easiest place to meet is at Jane Hunt's very large, lovely home. And so Elizabeth Cady Stanton travels from Seneca to Waterloo. They come down, they're all meeting. And at this tea, they're having a conversation about how frustrated they are. And it's not really about women's rights to vote. It's about you don't have property rights. It's about you don't have standing. It's about you aren't your own person and acknowledged in the law. And there's a movement in New York to give women control over their property, and that passes. And that's what many of these women were around. Lucretia Mott was actually not immediately for rights to vote for women. That was just too radical of an idea to wrap her head around. And she thought it would be ludicrous and be viewed as ludicrous and that they would be laughed out. But they resolve at this tea that they should do a convention. And it's incredible. Within just a few days, Elizabeth Cady Stanton uses all this legal training that she's got. She goes back to her home in Seneca, where she has moved a few years earlier after time in Boston. She writes the Declaration of Seneca, the Declaration of Sentiments. She comes back to Jane Hunt's house and Jane McClintock, and they edit it together. And a little bit aside, interesting, the Smithsonian. And this was an accident. I'm pretty certain it was an accident because I was talking to one of the curators. If you go into the Smithsonian, at least when I was there last fall, Thomas Edison's table where he wrote the Declaration of Independence is on one wall. And on the flip side of the wall is the table where the Declaration of Sentiments was written. Talk about an accident in history. I asked the curator, I said, was this on purpose? And she looked at me just a little bit, it wasn't on purpose. And I don't even think they realized, it was just this wonderful symmetry that the two tables are on opposite sides of each other, forming a whole. Anyway, so they write this thing, they get this group together, they have 300 people quickly assembled in Seneca, they put it in the newspaper. Susan B. Anthony is not there. She is not at this first convention. They haven't even met her yet. She's in Rochester. And Frederick Douglass is the only African-American who shows up. There is one young woman at this convention, young woman, 15. Come 1920, she will be the only woman alive who was at the original Seneca Falls Convention when women are finally granted the right to vote. So this is what launches, essentially from a US history perspective, the right of women to vote. But there's been lots of activity before, including among women of color, to gain rights to speak within the within the churches. There's been lots of agitation and discussion about this. It's just, it formalizes around this Declaration of Seneca, the Declarations of Sentiment and Seneca Falls. And these conventions start being replicated. And there's one in Rochester, which Susan B. Anthony literally sort of stumbles onto. And then later she and Elizabeth Cady Stanton meet and form this strong partnership, which then they are given a great deal of credit for, and rightfully so in many respects, for the path of women's suffrage. But that's only one part of the story. There are loads of other people, especially women of color, who are written out of this history and are now being written back in to the extent that we can find them, and that scholars are finding them and writing them back in. So it's a very interesting time. And then come the Civil War, you've gotten a lot of traction. And I've only found it in one book as a reference, but in Eleanor Cliff, who's a journalist in Washington, D.C., she's written a book called Founding Sisters in the 19th Amendment. And there's a passage where she writes that in the war, Abraham Lincoln asks them, the suffragettes who have gained traction, to stand down, let him handle the war. He'll take care of it after the war. And it's another 60 years before some women, not all, gained the right to vote by the 19th Amendment. In law, all women gained it. In practice, well, no, that's actually not true. In law, citizens gained it, but females who were citizens. But in practice, not all women gained it. So it's a very complex history between this period of the Civil War and the 1920s. And Katja, I'm going to ask you, how much more detail would you like from this whole period?
I think that's a great point, or a great point to lead over to Alison, because we are just around that time, the late 1840s, 1850s. And I wanted to ask Alison to tell us a little bit about Mathilde Franziska Anneke. And this is a name that most people will not have heard, maybe the historians amongst us. I hadn't heard of it. I learned nothing about her in school, even though she was from a region in Germany that we had covered very well. So Alison, I would very much like you to chime in about the German-American influence during that early phase of the suffrage movement. Alison?
Right, thank you. Yeah, and I guess it's sort of important to give a little bit of context, which is probably information that many of you are familiar with, that the immigration from German Europe really started picking up in the early 1850s. Of course, there have been Germans coming in the colonial period and the 1830s and on, but it's after the revolutions of 1848 and the economic turmoil associated with it that you start to see really large numbers coming. And Mathilde Franziska Anneke is one of those people who ends up in the United States in the early 1850s. And I think if we want to talk about the relationship between German Americans and the suffrage movement in the 19th century, Mathilde Anneke is a wonderful place to start, partly because she's just fascinating, inherently sort of fascinating as a human being, but also I think because her career kind of embodies the tensions. You can see in her career how it was difficult to be a public German American and feel really anchored in that community. She never really spoke very good English, so she was always very much part of the German community. But she was also a woman suffragist, and she knew Stanton, she knew Anthony, she defended them, and she often felt herself kind of pulled between two groups because German Americans, and I'm sure Mark Louden will speak to this further, German Americans were not impressed by the sort of this organized women's suffrage movement, the sort of Anglo-American women's suffrage movement, because it was very sort of based in Northeastern Protestantism, kind of this Yankee Protestantism. It came along with temperance. It came along with sort of rejecting amusements on the Sabbath, which is another sort of German thing. They wanted to be able to enjoy themselves on Sundays, and there was a movement against that. And also, I would have to say, people like Stanton would say derogatory things about German immigrants. They got a bit ticked off. They sort of, who are these men coming in some places, in Wisconsin, where I am, in some places they could come in and vote after a year without being a citizen, without speaking good English. And you have people like Stanton and Anthony who were sort of saying, how does that work? I'm really educated. And you have someone coming, you know, a peasant who maybe isn't literate, coming from Germany, being dumped into the American system. So that feeling led some of the Anglo-American suffragists to be quite negative about the German immigrant man. Anyway, so Matilda Arnecke, we have sort of between these two camps. She was born in 1817 in Prussian Westphalia, and she grew up sort of in a well-off family, but it sort of hit hard times as she was a teenager, and she ended up in a bad marriage, a marriage to a man who drank too much and was physically abusive. And things were similar in Germany to what Kate Howard just described, that women really didn't have kind of power within their marriages. And it was very difficult to get divorced. So Matilda Arnecke's experience of extricating herself from this violent marriage and getting custody of her daughter, that's really what puts her on a path to be a sort of strong women's rights advocate throughout her life. And she did manage it. She did manage to get a divorce, which was more than most people, but it was a big challenge. So in the 1840s, she's writing to support herself and her daughter. She's moving in increasingly radical circles in Münster. She writes a book called Das Weib im Konflikt mit dem sozialen Verhältnisse. So, woman in conflict with society. And there she sort of lays out this idea that society, in particular, she's thinking the Catholic Church, it oppresses women, enslaves women within marriage. And she sort of speaks out and says, German women, we need to free ourselves of these chains. We need to raise sort of strong, independent daughters. And it's interesting at this time that her opposition to organized religion, and I would describe her as an agnostic, kind of as she grows up. She's very educated in religion, but she's not a believer as an adult. That's one of the things that puts her kind of a bit at odds with many of the Anglo-American women. Anyway, so Matilda Arnecke ends up in the revolutions of 1848, these revolutions to unite Germany under a democratic regime of some kind, right? There are differences. She's at the radical end in 1848. She writes, she edits newspapers, plural, in Cologne. She even ends up fighting. She goes down to Baden with and fights with the Republican forces down there alongside her husband. She's a Ordnanzoffizieren, so an orderly, a sort of aide, an aide to her husband. And she rides around in battles giving people messages. But of course, the revolutions of 1848 fail. And Matilda Arnecke and her second husband, right, Fritz Arnecke, another radical, they end up moving to the United States, and in her case to Milwaukee. And that's where she publishes in 1852 the first woman-run feminist newspaper in the United States. It's Die Deutsche Frauenzeitung. So it's in German. We only have one issue that survived. But from that first issue, she says, I'm in favor of women's suffrage. It's the first time she says that really clearly. And it languishes as a newspaper. There's opposition by the Male Printers Union. She sort of moves it to different cities. Then she has this terrible tragedy where 4 of her children die. And so her personal life is kind of in turmoil, and the Deutsche Frauenzeitung doesn't survive. But Matilde Anneke is going to conferences, to women's suffrage conferences in New York. She is speaking publicly on behalf of women's suffrage, and this is in the 1850s. And then after the Civil War, she is one of the founding vice presidents of the National Women's Suffrage Association, which is the organization that Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton founded. And you can see in her correspondence and some of her published speeches that she is in this strange position where she's telling people like Stanton and Anthony, hey, tone down the temperance, tone down the Protestantism. Let's really focus on women's suffrage. If you do that, you might be able to convince some German immigrants to come along. But if you're making this a cultural issue, it's not going to work. And then at the same time, you can see her defending Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and in particular, when Elizabeth Cady Stanton says derogatory things about German immigrants. There's a big case in 1869 where Stanton made a speech and said, oh, Germany's backward in terms of gender, and said one of those times when she sort of said, oh, all these uneducated immigrant men who can come in and vote when women like me can't vote. So that became a little bit of a cause célèbre, and Anneke stepped in and kind of said, oh, well, you know what Stanton really means? She sort of like, she's really just talking about some people being educated and some people being uneducated. And of course there are uneducated people in all groups. And so she's really trying to kind of play the middle there. And she agreed with Stanton that Germany was not as advanced as the United States in terms of women's rights. So yeah, Matilde Anneke, and she does so many other fascinating things as well. She opposes slavery, rights against slavery, opens a girls' school, but she's a really interesting figure in the 19th century who's bridging these two worlds.
Thank you so much. Mark, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the German-American community at that time. Alison already hinted at that there was a lot of opposition from the German-American ethnic community, and of course immigration had also picked up after the 1848 revolution, and these were people who believed in liberal ideas, generally speaking, who came to the United States. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Sure. Boy, this is an ideal succession, starting off with Kate's overview and introduction, and then moving on to Alison's discussion of the consequences of the Revolution of 1848, and specifically Anneke's figure, which is a fascinating story in American history generally that needs to be told. So what I'm going to be sharing is a little bit of the overview, following up on the question that you just posed, Katja, about sort of the bigger picture in the German-American community, more towards its demographic high point, which is in the latter decades of the 19th century leading up to the beginning, at the turn of the 20th century. So as Alison had mentioned, you know, there had been immigration, German speakers in the colonial era, going back into the 17th century and the 18th century. but the numbers were very, very modest. And then in the decades leading up to the Civil War, like for example, coming to Wisconsin, 1830s, 1840s, but there was this sort of blip after the failed revolutions of 1848 and 1849, but it was really 1870s, 1880s, 1890s that there was this kind of boom. Total of 7 million German speakers emigrated to North America, most of whom came in those latter decades of the 19th century. And there was a lot of, to think about sort of German Americans and specifically the cause of women's suffrage, one has to kind of understand where German Americans were coming from politically, or how they were identifying or finding their place on the American political landscape. And if we think about sort of, the latter half of the 19th century, we have two major parties, as we do today, Republicans and Democrats. Of course, the ideologies of the parties at that time were almost inverted from what they are today, which was a result of a switch mainly in the 1960s. But basically, the Republican Party was the party of the Union, right? The party of Lincoln. The idea of sort of looking at the country as sort of with a stronger through unity and a stronger central government. And so Republicans were generally in favor of taxes and standing armies and national banks and these kinds of things, and sort of geographic ideals. Whereas the Democratic Party was much more sort of the power to the people. The idea that local government is preferable over central government, lower taxes, Washington or, Harrisburg in Pennsylvania or Springfield in Illinois off my back kind of thing. And so basically German Americans, so neither of the major parties really were drawn to the suffrage movement. It was really something that was kind of a separate social phenomenon that was not adopted as a kind of party platform by either of the big parties. So that was sort of, excluded that way. And that sort of exclusion of women's suffrage as kind of an issue then carried over into German Americans, many of whom had some sort of political, if not activity, then at least an identity. They were, interested in participating in electoral politics in the United States. And by and large, I don't know if there are statistics on this, but it was probably more or less balanced in terms of those who were Republican versus Democrats. But that really had less to do with, say, anything specifically German cultural and to the demographic fact if they were living in urban areas versus rural areas. So rural German Americans tended to vote Democrat, like their rural American neighbors generally, Anglos and other immigrant groups, non-Anglo groups. Urbanites tended to be more Republican. So the 48ers that came, for example, Karl Schurz is the most famous one. Karl Schurz was, the party that the Republicans of Germany, small r, those that were supporting the revolutions were supporting, became big R Republicans generally in America. And so there was a lot of progressive thinking in terms of education and support for a stronger parliamentary democracy in Germany was kind of carried over to strong support for the Union. Now, so there wasn't a kind of political, the sort of political division between Republicans and Democrats among German Americans really didn't have any kind of direct relevance on their support or not support for women's suffrage. By and large, they all could agree or generally agree that they were not in support of women's suffrage. And a lot of that had to do with a carryover of German cultural values and then specifically religious values. So again, and there was a lot of diversity as there is today, but a lot of diversity across the German American cultural landscape in terms of political identifications, but also in terms of religion. And so if we think about the two major religious groups in German America at the end of the 19th century, they were Catholics and Lutherans. And even the Catholics and Lutherans were not exactly blood brothers in a lot of respects, but a couple of things that sort of united them together. First was a sense of feeling marginalized by Anglo-Americans. So this picks up on something that Alison mentioned before. There was this feeling, specifically in the women's suffrage movement, this was a New England thing, right? This was a Yankee thing. And specifically, if you think of New England Yankees, you think of Protestants. Now, Lutherans were also Protestants, but they were not that kind of Protestant. So they were not Congregationalists. They were not Methodists. I mean, if, you know, Anglo churches, English-speaking churches, Protestant churches were seen going back to the colonial era as a major threat, especially to German Lutherans. So there wasn't the sort of pan-Protestant feeling of identity whatsoever. So there was this kind of ethnic, to a certain extent, tribalism of sort of like Germans on the one hand versus Yankees on the other. And a couple of, I'd say, the two major issues that also sort of united German Americans of different political stripes and the Catholic Protestant divide, the two issues were the support for language maintenance, so the maintenance of German in some form, especially in education, particularly in parochial education, parochial schools. And second was the temperance question. And Alison referred to that as sort of also in the larger context of what you could or couldn't do on the Sabbath. But one thing that really united Germans was the temperance question. And it is quite true that the women's suffrage movement was part of the larger women's movement in which temperance was a big deal. And it was seen as sort of, you know, the kind of restrictions placed on alcohol and the consumption and sale of alcohol were seen by women's rights advocates as something to promote women's safety and the safety of women and children and the intact quality of families from alcoholic men. And so the German Americans, in a sense, kind of recognized the dysfunction in the excessive consumption of alcohol among their Anglo-American male neighbors. And so I do a lot of work, including preparation for the panel discussion today, by looking at digitized newspapers, German language newspapers, which give this incredible grassroots view of what American society was like, including through the prism of German speakers. And there was a really interesting sort of recognition on the part of German writers who were not in favor of women's suffrage at all, but did sympathize with the woes of excessive alcohol consumption. And they said, but that's a Yankee thing. And it's a Yankee thing that they've inherited from the British. In other words, basically British are inclined to be drunks, right? And so that's carried over into Anglo-America, and they don't drink beer and wine, which are really not spirited beverages, right? Those are just, that's for your health, right? What they're drinking is the hard stuff, right? The whiskey, right? And their cough medicine that every Yankee has in their medicine cabinet, which is, you know, a kind of, you know, a spirits. And so they said, you know, when Anglo-American men drink, they drink to get drunk, right? And when Germans consume alcohol, it's to basically, it's for their health, right? And they don't go over the limit. And it's really fascinating. This one article I was reading made a long discussion, sort of veered from women's suffrage into the cultural difference between a saloon, and they use the English word saloon, which we would call a bar today, versus a German Wirtshaus, which we would sort of call, like, the term is not widespread outside of Wisconsin, but we refer to as taverns, right? So there's a distinction between, or Wirtschaft, Wirtshaus, sort of, if you think about sort of your classic kind of German place where you would go for a beer or wine, and then also have your meal. It's a place that you feel completely comfortable taking your children, your wife and your children to, right? As opposed to a bar, right? Which no person of decent reputation would want to be seen in. So they say, you know what we need to do in order to improve the status of women in American societies, first of all, to keep them away from Anglo-American men, and to do something about these horrible saloons. But there was a lot of, argument. There's one quote that I found that was wonderful, that they were talking about sort of comparing German women to American women. And they say that German women weave roses into earthly life. American women have thorns. And so they saw American women as a little bit too spunky, a little bit too edgy. And there were a lot of stories when they were talking about, they're trying to emphasize why their skepticism and criticism of the women's suffrage movement was justified. They would emphasize the so-called militant suffragettes. So in other words, these women in something like Carrie Nation would be one, but it was less of an issue in the United States as it was in Great Britain. But there were some real, if you Google like militant suffragettes, there are some stories of like majorly radical, violent actions where women were coming into meetings with hatchets and pouring, things into mailboxes and, having, violent demonstrations, or at least having demonstrations that turned violent, because of anti-protesters, that sort of thing. But there was definitely a fringe, there was a group of suffragettes who were much more militant, and sort of like women's power in some cases violent way. And so those were that kind of scary militant side of the movement was something that many people in the German American press played up. But German Americans, the sympathy for the status of women and the respect for women and the recognition that they probably should be included in political life, or at least public life, to a greater degree started to increase at the end of the 19th century, not through a kind of direct line from the 48ers, who at that point there was no sort of real kind of clear 48er identity in German America. They had sort of, kind of blended in with other German Americans, especially Republican Americans. But the real change was the rise of socialism. So when you had the immigration of socialists from Germany post-unification, so post-1871, and socialism was very much a big deal in a lot of German American cities, Milwaukee being one. Last socialist mayor was into the early 1960s. Virtually all of them, I think all of them except one, were German Americans. And so socialists and progressive socialists from day one basically said, women's rights are human rights, and they're rights of the proletariat. This is workers' rights. Women are working, children sadly are working. In order for us to organize workers and to improve the lives of everyone, we need to enlist women. And so they were, if you look at the socialist German papers, like the socialist English language papers, there was no question in their mind whatsoever that women's suffrage was a very, very important issue. But the temperance thing obviously was something that was really, there's this fear that if women were given the right to vote, and if women were, German American women were inclined to side with their Yankee counterparts, that would mean prohibition. Well, that's not exactly how it played out, but here today we're celebrating the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment. Go back a couple of amendments, and we have in January of 1919, so just a year and a half earlier, was the complete ratification and enactment of the Prohibition Amendment. So in other words, prohibition was already the law of the land before women's suffrage really finally came to be. And what was very interesting was that the German American press was looking specifically at states, US states that had given women the right to vote at the state level. And already by 1920, a good 20 US states had granted women the right to vote. So these were in a sense kind of laboratories for seeing what would happen when women got the right to vote, seeing what they were doing in certain states. It was fascinating. I didn't realize before this panel that of those 20 states, almost all of them were Western states. So we're going down the list: Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, Idaho, Washington, California, Oregon, Montana, Arizona, Kansas, and Alaska. Those are just the top ones I'm reading off. They're all Western states. And many of those Western states also did have sizable German presences. And there was a very, very interesting article that was done by a newspaper that had started off as being very, very critical in its editorial line to women's suffrage, but they said, okay, let's see what happens in Colorado. And so they looked very, very closely at a number of initiatives that were on the ballot in the 1912 election, including things, the 8-hour law for workers, so limiting the working day to 8 hours, public assistance for single mothers, things that were basically considered sort of, good social legislation, and also temperance, right? And so what they found was that when women, and of course they could distinguish between male and female votes, but 1912 was the first election that women had voted in Colorado. And they noticed that all these really good pieces of social legislation passed. And so they're presuming that this was because of women's support, and women's issues would be considered sort of family issues and public issues and protecting, workers' rights and that sort of thing. They said they're very good. And they say, but then they looked and temperance was overwhelmingly rejected. And so they basically was like saying, phew, sigh of relief. You have all these women voting exactly how we would want them to vote, which is for all the things that we support in terms of, social legislation, but against temperance. And they say, okay, then maybe this isn't too bad. Maybe this isn't such a big risk. But there's a lot more that one could go into, but just one other little thing that I wanted to kind of talk about on the language level. And the use of the term, so women's rights, was translated as you would find it in Germany, so Frauenrechte, so Frauenrechte. and Wahlrecht and Stimmrecht were the terms that were used to describe suffrage or vote, the right to vote. So if you had a newspaper that used the term Frauenrechte, then you could bet that they were going to be a reasonably objective, have a reasonably objective take on the situation. So maybe skeptical, to a certain extent critical, but probably not outrageously negative. There was another term that was used, which was Weiberrechte. And Weib, of course, in earlier forms of German and dialect, was simply, a term for a woman. But already by the end of the 19th century, it had negative connotations. So something like, broad or something like that, or worse. And so when you have like Weiberrechte and Weiberfanatikerinnen, Temperenzfanatikerinnen, so fanaticists, and then you say, okay, I know where this is going. And so, a lot of these newspapers are actually searchable by keyword. And so when I discovered that Weiberrecht was the sort of code for a lot of, negative views on women's suffrage, then I was able to dig a little bit deeper and find them. But so it was a very, very interesting, and by the time the 1920 rolled around, reading the reactions of it, most of the newspapers said, this is where it's going. But one interesting thing that sort of set the stage for sort of this kind of, okay, well, we're not going to fight this and, let's, see what we can do, was to follow what was going on in Germany. So in Germany, women got the right to vote at the end of World War I. So basically the eve of the Weimar Republic. And there was a lot of coverage in the press in 1919 of the Nationalversammlung, sort of the original sort of like Weimar Republic setting up of a parliament for the short-lived republic. And this is where women had gained the right to vote in 1918 in Germany. And so this was the first sort of national test, especially in Prussia, of like, what will women do? Will they stop, putting their kids to bed, as was feared before? Will they read the paper in the morning instead of making their husband's breakfast? Will they go out on the streets and march? Will they go to political clubs at night and smoke? But all these kind of things that have been feared before, and they realize, German women are actually behaving themselves quite well. And there were a number of German feminists in the early 20th century, a woman I hadn't heard before named Minna Kauer, who was actually somewhat radical, sort of a latter-day Matilde Franziska Anneke in Germany, whose speeches were printed in their entirety. And they were actually quite moderate, despite what some of their male counterparts would have thought. And so there was this kind of looking to Germany as like saying, Germany screwed up in a lot of ways as far as its political situation, and we're not fans of the Kaiser. But this whole kind of movement toward a republic and this, the early Weimar Republic, and having women sort of be included in that, maybe it's something that could work out in post-World War I America as well. So that, in some ways, kind of tilled the soil a little bit for the recognition that it wasn't necessarily going to be, a horrible cultural problem for German American women. But really the fact that prohibition was already on the books kind of laid that question to rest about the temperance issue. So
it calmed them down. It stopped their worries there a bit. Kate, I'd like to go back to you actually. Mark already touched upon that. We've moved forward a few decades. We are in the progressive era, the 1890s to 1920, which is of course then when the suffrage movement really gained traction and started to become more mainstream. It spread from the Western states, many of whom were giving women voting rights at the state level. They couldn't do it at the federal level, but at the state level they could. And eventually even Teddy Roosevelt started supporting suffrage. But yet there were still some opponents, and surprisingly, there were even opponents among fellow women who thought, this is all just a bit too much. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that later stage during the women's rights movement, so the last 30 years leading up to the passage of the 19th Amendment, and what was happening there on a broader level.
I can. I'm gonna, before I go into the opposition, I want to briefly touch on a couple of things that both Mark and Alison alluded to. Part of that latter period, the 1900s to 1920s, it's a consequence of a very key period between 1870 and the 1910, which is you have a lot of splits and wedges put in the movement. and differences of approaches, because some states, before they were states, territories, had granted women full suffrage. Wyoming, Utah, again, anything west of the Mississippi, pretty much it's not going to be as big of an issue. And there was a strategy decision when they weren't getting a federal suffrage amendment through. It failed. The 16th Amendment failed after the Civil War. And you had a huge splintering between Frederick Douglass, Susan B. Anthony, and Elizabeth Kamm Stanton on the 13th Amendment, which was the Emancipation Proclamation, the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment, 16th fails. And in around 1869, there's a massive divide where Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, educated women, are just beyond themselves upset that they are not going to have the vote, which also is what Alison is alluding to when she's talking about these comments about, you know, a man can come off the boat, be granted citizenship, and he gets the right to vote. He doesn't even speak, you know, they're terrible statements that come out because there's a great deal of bitterness. By this time, you have women who are they're in their, she's no longer a 25-year-old woman. She's in her latter years of life. She will never vote in her lifetime, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, nor will Susan B. Anthony. They pass the torch on, and their movements splinter at various points in times, and it's too complex to go into this at this point. But you end up with a split in how you're going to go about enfranchising women. Do it at the federal level or take it to the states. And yes, there was lots of suffrage for women across the states, and there's a couple of interesting suffrage maps out on the web which one can look at. But suffrage was not, if you said a woman had suffrage in a state, it didn't mean she had full suffrage. It meant she might be allowed to vote on certain issues. Maybe she could vote for governor and president, but she couldn't vote on taxes, and she couldn't vote on the school board in her local county, or vice versa. I mean, it was this patchwork quilt. It's crazy when you look at it now. And it goes all the way up from 1869 all the way up to 1920. The other thing that's really important about this patchwork quilt is that in order to come into the Union, it became a negotiation issue. Utah has the right to vote, then they lose the right to vote, then they get the right to vote back. I mean, it's just, it's really crazy, honestly, when you look at it now. And it's interesting what Mark was saying about the two terms, Frauenrecht versus, I think Mark, you said it was Weiberrecht, excuse me if I don't get it correctly, because you have the same thing happening in Britain and the US. I said earlier when I was speaking, I used the term suffragette, and I actually did it deliberately. But actually, if you look at US, you can talk with historians, American suffragists was the term used to describe a woman advocating for suffrage, or a man advocating for suffrage, up until around 1906 or 1908, when Charles Hunt, a reporter in New England, writes a scathing editorial about those suffragettes. He tried to turn it into a derogatory term. And the British suffragettes, and one American who was living in England who used it in a book that she wrote, flipped it and said, we will take suffragette and we will own it, which is why I like the term. Suffragette, not suffragette, the French expression, but suffragette. We are going to get the vote. And so you come up to this point, there's a sea change of politics stepping on top of each other and across different countries. And there's a whole series of countries that start granting women national suffrage across Western democracies. Not all. Switzerland, much, much later. France after World War II. But you start seeing a sea change around 1918, England. Germany after the war, that's a natural consequence. And then the US. You also see the sea change of politicians getting on the bandwagon because the writing's on the wall. Wilson in particular is a really good example of that. He was adamantly, so anyway, so to keep going on this. So this is actually then a nice segue. That was the other thing I was going to say, is that it's interesting that the Germans, what Mark was talking about, focusing on the Yankee thing, because across the Mississippi, people weren't paying attention to it too much. They just were taking care of their business and doing it. So it's interesting how things become, you see the cultural differences across the US. And the southern states, a whole different approach. So those were the couple things I wanted to talk about. And also with respect to the conventions, there were no women at any US convention until 1900. I was just trying to Google quickly when the first men of color were at a convention. But women did not show up until a Republican convention in 1900, and then later that year at a Democratic convention, first women. So again, that wasn't a sphere that we were in. So too dirty, and that's actually one of the reasons you have, that's my segue into opposition. It's what was appropriate for a wife and a mother. Politics are dirty. You don't need to get into that. We don't do public speaking roles. We don't need a man, we don't need to have our own voice because we are represented and stored and cared for by our husbands. There was a wonderful quote I found, and I can't find it now, but it was after the Titanic sunk, that somebody quipped about the fact that it was who went to the boats first, not votes for women, but women. And so it was just kind of an interesting, it's actually on one of the, which I highly recommend, the National Park Service site. They have a fantastic women's historical park site, also the Belmont Paul House. Absolutely fantastic resources for information. You can just keep going into a perpetual clicks for the next link to look at, the next link to look at, the next link to look at. So that's a lot of some of the, it just got in people's craws. It's like, well, that's just not what we do. And what's interesting about the opposition to women's suffrage is the arguments are not all that different today. They are the same arguments that came up in 2016 when Hillary Clinton ran for presidency. They are the same arguments that resurfaced when the Equal Rights Amendment was argued in the 70s and the 80s. And so it's that type of opposition, those sorts of stereotypes come up over and over and over again. And we are still reliving them right now with what's going on in the US. So today, I would argue, it's my opinion. The other reason that there was opposition was really clever. If there's some wonderful new books out because of the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. But there's some wonderful stories about coming out of Tennessee, and you look at the lobbying behind this. And quite frankly, it was preservation of your political life that you may or may not oppose suffrage, because there were concerns by, again, the alcohol industry. They were funding heavily the anti-suffrage movement at the Hermitage Hotel in Tennessee. They had I think it was the Jim Beam room. The summer when they were, today, as many of you may know, was the day that suffrage passed by one vote in Tennessee, because Harry Byrne read a note from his mother that said, please take care of Mrs. Katz's suffragettes. And he switched his vote. And this was echoed actually across the states. There was a lot of opposition to suffrage. And there was a lot, and I just, if you will indulge me, we posted on this on a social media initiative I have called Vote Girl Vote. And we call it the states late to the ratification party. And the reasons that they either voted it down because they opposed it, or they voted it down because it was not, they frankly were not willing to call the legislature back into session, the state legislatures back into session to deal with it, because they didn't want to have the consequences that they would face if X number million of women, sorry, I've forgotten the number, X number of million of women were enfranchised in the 2020 presidential election, the 1920 presidential election. So late to the ratification party, and these will surprise you. Some won't, but some will. Connecticut didn't come back into session to do it. Belatedly ratified September 14th, 1920. Vermont, belatedly ratified 1921. Delaware, yes, Delaware, it's more southern than you think, rejected it by vote 1920, belatedly ratified 1923. Maryland rejected the 19th Amendment 1920, belatedly ratified 1941. Virginia rejected it 1920, belatedly ratified 1952. No. Alabama rejected 1919, belatedly ratified 1953. Florida belatedly ratified 1969. South Carolina rejected it in 1920, belatedly ratified it in 1969. Now think about the timing of when they've redone this. What's going on in the US in the 60s? Georgia rejected it 1919, belatedly ratified 1970. Louisiana rejected it 1920, belatedly ratified it 1970. North Carolina belatedly ratified it 1971. Mississippi rejected it March 29th, 1920, belatedly ratified it May 22nd, 1984.
No.
I did not know that. I really did not know that. Wow.
And what is so fascinating is when you overlay the ratification, 36 ratification states, remember we were 48 in the Union at that time. Hawaii also got Hawaii, Alaska later. But votes weren't really an issue in Hawaii and Alaska. And you overlay the ERA amendment, culturally it's still the same.
Mm-hmm.
Now that's just my opinion, and I'm not an expert historian on this, but that's my impression. I see the cultural, you see the changes, and we're in a similar one right now with this summer. They will refer to this summer in the history books in years to come. And what are we talking about? We're talking about bringing back together what was severed by the 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th, and 19th Amendments. What are we dealing with now? These arguments repeat and repeat and repeat.
Thank you so much, Kade. I really did not know that. My state of residence, Virginia, is amongst those two, and I am genuinely surprised and a bit shocked that it took them so long. Thank you very, very much.
Take a look at the National Park Service sites. I really do recommend it. And if anybody's looking for once people feel safe to travel again or whatever, I just am a huge fan of the Belmont Paul House in right next to the Senate Hart Building, interestingly enough, and that's a fascinating story. In Washington, D.C., the American History Museum, where I said the two tables abut each other but don't even realize it, and also Seneca Falls. It's just I did my own little pilgrimage up there last year, and I'm so grateful I did it now. It was just an amazing. I learned a great deal.
Thank you so much. Alison, I would like to come back to you. You are our case study and biography expert today, and you already gave us such wonderful insight into the life of Mathilde Franziska Anneke. And she was, of course, an early women's rights advocate, an early suffragist, and also active in the abolitionist movement. But as we are now around the turn of the last century, around 1900, well into the progressive era, we have even more women, German-American women, who take an active role. And many of them, not surprisingly, are in Wisconsin. Mark already told us that there was a socialist element in Wisconsin. And I was wondering if you could chime in here, please.
Sure, I'm really happy to be able to pick up on Mark's point that it's among German Americans, socialists are really important for women's rights activists in the United States. There were certainly male socialists who weren't that enthusiastic, but there are some very strong women who are advocating for women's rights, equal pay. Which again, if we're talking about issues that are still relevant today, and women's right to vote. And a lot of German American socialists sort of didn't want to leave it to the middle class Anglos to lead this suffrage movement, and they were inspired by people in Germany, by women in Germany. So it's not always so easy to find, but you can find labor unions, or you can find women at the local level. There's a Deutsche Frauenstimmrecht Verein in New York City, so a women's suffrage organization in New York City in 1872, and we think that's mostly a socialist organization from what we can tell. And the socialist parties, they had all these different names, they put women's right to vote on their national platforms earlier than the major parties. And I have another fascinating biography, and yes, a Wisconsinite. Meta Berger was an important Milwaukee socialist who advocated for women's voting rights. She was married to Victor Berger, who is perhaps more famous. He served in Congress. And he was famous for being prosecuted for speaking against World War I and jailed. And while he was jailed, his constituents in Milwaukee voted him back into Congress, although he was in jail. And so it's this interest. They did it twice even. He was later, the sentence was overturned by the Supreme Court on a technicality. But he's quite famous, and he was a Jewish Austrian immigrant who started publishing a German language newspaper in Milwaukee and then moved over to English. And Meta Berger, she was originally Meta Schlechtling. She was the daughter of German immigrants, so sort of one generation removed, but she grew up speaking German. And she's very much part of this German language public sphere, this German American community in Milwaukee, and even more so once she hooks up with, once she marries Victor Berger. She's a teacher for a brief time, then she devotes herself to supporting her husband and her husband's career and raising her children. And then she is elected to the school board. In Milwaukee, in Wisconsin, women could vote for the school board. In 1909, she was elected. And she served for about nearly 30 years. There were some breaks, but she was on the school board for a long time. And she was a socialist. She ran as a socialist for the school board. Later on, she would go on to be on the board of regents for Marx University, University of Wisconsin. So she went on to other positions as well. But again, her career with suffrage tells the interesting kind of story of German immigrants and their relationship to the issue. She was part of the Wisconsin Women's Suffrage Association, which is affiliated with the mainstream group. So those splits have kind of healed at this point, and there is this mainstream group led by Carrie Chapman Catt, who's very well played by Angelica Houston, if you want to sort of figure, I don't know. Angelica Houston plays a very good Carrie Chapman Catt, I think. Meta Berger was, for a time, affiliated with this mainstream organization, despite being a socialist, being more radical than the leaders of this group. But during World War I, Carrie Chapman Catt's strategy was, let's identify with the war effort. Let's kind of try to win Wilson's favor. Let's show America that you cannot win a war without women's support, and then sort of hoping to be rewarded and recognized for that. It had worked in some ways for African-American men with the Civil War, and there's a similar sort of thinking, but the Bergers, like most of the Germans of Milwaukee were not interested in World War I. They were not keen on the United States getting involved. And when the United States did get involved in 1917, they took a range of positions. The Bergers were at the sort of radical end of saying, no, we're going to speak against conscription. We're going to speak against the war. So Meta Berger drops out of the Wisconsin Women's Suffrage Association, right? The mainstream group. And she joins the National Women's Party. And some people are maybe familiar with Alice Paul, Lucy Burns. There was a good HBO movie about this, I Endured Angels. So National Women's Party is trying to sort of goad Wilson. So during World War I, you have these two suffrage groups where one's trying to sort of say, hey, look, we're good, loyal citizens who can help you win the war. And then the other one, the National Women's Party with Alice Paul that Meta Berger signed on to, are saying, hey, if we're, hey, Wilson, if you're fighting for democracy, you have to enfranchise women. So it's sort of a different way of using World War I. And you can see how being German in Milwaukee was part of that, was part of those machinations for Meta Berger.
Thank you. Actually, that leads me very nicely to my last question. Mark, if you could just, before we open it up to questions, very briefly chime in here again on the World War I question. Of course, there was a lot of anti-German sentiment coming out of that. And do you think that had an impact on the suffrage movement, particularly in Wisconsin, but also in other states where German immigrants were heavily represented, where they had settled?
Well, yeah, definitely World War I was not a good time to be German American. Although it's become almost legendary in terms of a lot of harsh negative consequences, and certainly there were a couple of incidents and some legislation that was targeted against German Americans, including the use of language in the press and so forth. But that's kind of a little footnote, but it's important for people to recognize that a lot of what is sort of hyped up about the impact of World War I on German America is a little bit overblown. What was really a concern, so there was a very strong anti-Wilson feeling among German Americans at the time, in part because of him leading into World War I. So there's no question about that. But they were, I mean, German Americans were not a fifth column for the Kaiser. So it wasn't like they were, they were concerned about their suffering cousins and siblings or whatever over there, but it wasn't because they loved the Kaiser. They really didn't have, going back to the colonial era, whatever was going on politically in Germany was generally rejected or not of much interest or whatever for German Americans, for German immigrants and their descendants. I think that the darker, when they were talking about Wilsonismus, they use that word, Wilsonismus, when they were thinking about anti-Wilson, they were thinking about clamps on immigration. So the idea, and this is obviously nativism, was kind of a big deal as far as the 1920s, 1930s, and even later. And so they were concerned that there would be this sort of general kind of, this was kind of like the Anglo-Americans, and Wilson was a very kind of Anglo-American archetype in many ways, where sort of like, this was yet another way for them to kind of clamp on us in our culture. I think that, his belated, as Kate said, support for women's suffrage was something that really didn't have much of an impact. But I think already at that point, the World War I era, and German Americans seeing the writing on the wall that suffrage was coming, in large part because it had been, already the law of the land, at least to a certain extent in various states. The major concern was like saying, how can we enlist women to vote against Wilsonism? In other words, how can we, now it's sort of like, political parties saying, oh my gosh, we've got a lot of immigrants, we've got a lot of Hispanics, we've got a lot of, folks that were, that form voting blocks that people didn't think of a generation ago. What are we going to do to get their vote, to court their vote? And so there was a kind of practical discussion in the German press, German language press, about how can we educate women properly to take the proper stand on certain issues, and to sort of in defense of kind of somewhat more liberal immigration policies, and then eventually the rejection of the prohibition. Those were two things that were sort of on their conscience. But Kate, also, I think Kate, I think you were going to inject a comment there too, so I didn't want to cut you off there.
The question was to you, Mark. It's over to Katja.
Oh, okay. So
yeah, no, I would actually at this point like to open it up to questions from our participants. So if you would like to ask something, comment on something, please feel free to speak up. You can turn on your microphone if you have muted yourself, and ask away, please.
How much of an influence did the Catholic Church have during the early 1900s? They've always been known as being very conservative. They still have their issues today with women. were they silent about it, or were they quite active about this, about women's rights, really?
Well, I would say, there were a number of newspapers always had a line. In other words, they had a clear sort of editorial stance, be it, say, Republican or Democrat or Socialist, but then also Republican versus, Catholic versus Lutheran. Those were, so a paper like the Germania in Milwaukee that was considered a Lutheran paper. Amerika, published in St. Louis, was one of the most prominent German Catholic newspapers. And typically, it was more strident in the Catholic press than in the Lutheran press. There's no question about that. But it was a drumbeat, a constant drumbeat of saying, women are virtuous. Their virtue needs to be protected. Therefore, we need to keep them away from politics because politics is dirty. Keep in mind that American politics at the end of the 19th century was a really messy business. I mean, incredible corruption, a real malaise around the time of the centennial. Bank failures and just sort of financial crises and the big political machines. This is why the socialists and the progressives were seen as such a positive alternative, because they were all about clean government, right? It wasn't about sort of like Karl Marx. It was just basically clean water, sewers, schools that function, and rather than Tammany backroom deal type stuff between men smoking cigars. So it's so the Catholics were very strident in saying that yes, it's basically the virtuous model Christian woman is at home and taking care of her husband and kids. But one thing that was interesting too, they also said that liberal divorce laws would work against women, because then men would abandon their wives, and where would wives be, right? So that was one thing that they were sort of saying against divorce, because it was less about freeing women from abusive relationships. It was about protecting women from being abandoned by their husbands. Another thing that is a theme that was interesting in the Catholic press is say, why do we need to have women vote? Because there are all these wonderful women's organizations that are doing good things, like Catholic Women's this and that, right? So various organizations where they were kind of doing, grassroots sort of social welfare things that, was improving society. They say, it's sort of the arguments like, why aren't women priests? Well, they say there's a lot of space for women to do a lot of other things in the Catholic Church on the grassroots level for good, like working as teachers and nurses and these kinds of things. And so they were sort of arguing there is a real space for good Catholic women to serve society without getting their hands dirty by becoming involved in politics.
We have another question here from Yogi.
Thank you. Yogi Redman, Northfield, Minnesota. Mark nicely mentioned the socialists from Germany around 1871, 1870. Interestingly enough, there was a movement with socialist Turnvereins. In the case of Davenport, the Sozialistischer Turnverein was founded August 1852, and we have the first speech at the inauguration of the Turnverein, which was delivered by Theodor Gülich. And he said in 1852, a young radical from Schleswig-Holstein, a radical Republican, das Weib soll der Partner des Mannes sein. The women should be the partners of the men. So he is clearly with other Sozialistischen Turnverein, the umbrella organization, in favor of women's rights and suffrage and so on. Whereas his father and that generation, he was a son of a Paulskirchenabgeordneter, they clearly stress that women should be at home and kids and church. So interestingly enough, these Sozialistische Turnvereine did not, at least in Davenport, had a long career. They were just changed to a normal Turnverein. But I think that's an early indication of German 48ers supporting equal rights. And in our case, the Schleswig-Holsteiners, Mathilde Peters, spouse of a 1848er, a young radical her publications, her poems in the German newspaper Der Demokrat showed, like Franziskus Anneke, early, very early progressive ideas, even in a smaller town like Davenport, Eastern Iowa. Thank you.
You.
Yeah, I would sort of build on that, that I think it was part of the 48er spirit to be interested in sort of more egalitarian relationships, and sort of really thinking of marriage as more of a partnership. So I think even people like Karl Schurz's wife, Margareta Schurz, who was involved in running a kindergarten. I mean, it's still very much sort of women's sphere, but she's sort of known for bringing Froebel's educational philosophies to early childhood education. And I think that there was a sort of general acceptance of kind of that women should be sort of respected, and that we should think more of women as equals among the 48ers. And there were a few who were supportive of women's suffrage, like Adolf Duay and Karl Heinzen, of the very radical Karl Heinzen, and kind of unusual too, right? Idiosyncratic Karl Heinzen in Boston. Yeah, I think it's interesting to sort of think about what exactly did they mean when they're interested in women being more prominent. And Matilda Anneke, I would say, she was always very well respected in the German community, and she was seen as a woman of learning, an erudite woman, a woman who represented Germans well. I've even in 1869, when she was involved in this national suffrage organization, a group of parents wrote sort of saying, don't worry. She was teaching the school, and these German American parents said, you know, she's really impressive. Don't worry about that woman's suffrage stuff. You can still trust her. She's fine. So it's interesting to see what exactly women's rights meant in different contexts to different people. Yeah.
And again, if you put it in the time context, this is the period at the height of, this is right after Seneca Falls, and there's just a roller coaster of conventions following and spreading, and that message does translate across different communities. So it's not surprising that this might have actually gotten it might have reached Iowa and Davenport. It's only when the Civil War comes in there and the focus becomes back on the Civil War. That doesn't repeat itself during World War I. You actually have a split in the movement, which had actually been building before then. The militancy that Mark was referring to, it came out of England. And Alice Paul had spent time in England, and she split with Kat, and took and formed the National Women's Party. And they were much more, they were willing to be much more assertive about their desire to get the vote. And it was Alice Paul's group that does what Alison's talking about, which is they were the silent sentinels in front of the White House all through World War I. And there was a tremendous amount of violence against them, as well as because of their lack of patriotism, that they were putting their desire for democracy and a right to vote. It was viewed as being unpatriotic to the war effort. And there's some incredible issues that happened with them with the imprisonment. I have you really can't see it here, but I have the pin, a copy of the pin. It's a jailhouse with a chain across it. And this is a replica of the pin that was given to every woman who served time in jail. And then they did what they called the jailhouse, I'm calling it the Jailhouse Express. There's a term for it. I'm sorry, I've forgotten it. But they basically, all the women who had served time in jail and endured some pretty horrific conditions and hunger struck, went across the country advocating for suffrage. So there's logic. If you look at the sea changes that are happening globally, if you look at the sea changes that are happening across the country, there's sort of logic for this up and down, up and down.
Are there any other questions? Just speak up. Yes?
May I speak? Can you hear me?
Yes, of course. Yes, we can hear you just fine.
All right, my name is Hardy Van Almela. I'm from Philadelphia. On two occasions, I think first Mark and then Alison referred to Margareta Schultz. and her opening up the first kindergarten. I was just wondering, since this was an absolute first in this country, to what extent has the fact that the kindergarten movement was originated by a woman, what kind of effect did this have on the women's right suffrage movement? Would either of the three illicit historians talk about this?
I'm not sure that there's a direct connection between specifically, say, the kindergarten movement and generally progressive ideas among the 48ers about education.
Mm-hmm.
In general, I mean, a lot of good ideas in American public education originated with German immigrants in the 19th century. It's not to be too ethnocentric. The state of Anglo education prior to, like in the colonial era, was abysmal. And there was a lot of rote memorization, you know, not much physical activity, no science, you know, manual arts, these kinds of things. I mean, the kindergarten idea was basically, it's funny, in Germany today, a kindergarten is not what we think of as a kindergarten in the United States. The idea was basically, you know what, maybe age 6 is just a little bit late to start formal education for kids. Kids seem to be ready to learn at maybe, say, 5. And, you know, there's a lot of educational psychology to back that up, but it's still something that's rejected by many Europeans. And I don't, you know, because, you know, when women were taken seriously in political discourse for things like, for certain issues, then usually things that were like social legislation and education, those were issues that were there. And, you know, again, the socialists were saying yet another reason why women should be voting, because social legislation is important. Whereas others were saying there's no need for them to vote. They can do all these things by being teachers. They can maybe, you know, at the local level serve on school boards. Again, it's the same sort of thing like you get today. It's like, why can't women be priests in the Catholic Church? It's like, well, it's not a question of keeping women down. It's a question of, you know, sort of division of labor. Men can do this and women should do that because women are better inclined to do these things. So, I mean, it could, the education thing was really sort of, I think, a double-edged sword as far as the right to vote.
It's interesting, in 1915, when the women were advocating, and especially in New York, for state suffrage at the state level. And by the way, the New York Times opposed it. The New York Times opinion editorial board opposed suffrage for women in that era. There were political cartoons, and I can't show it here, but the cartoon I'm looking at is a bunch of, it's half a dozen babies. And the baby in the front is holding a flag that says, votes for our mothers. And the lead title is, Give Mother the Vote, We Need It. Our food, our health, our play, our homes, our schools, our work are ruled by men's votes. Isn't it a funny thing that father cannot see why mother ought to have the vote? On how these things should be. Think it over. And that was one of the tools that the suffrage movement used. They sold suffrage cookbooks to raise funds, and it was actually a space where women were able to use their skills that were not welcomed in, say, mainstream editorial boards. So there was a whole series of women who were doing political cartoons, and this is one of the examples of the suffrage. And if you go to Belmont Paul House, in one of the third-floor rooms are walls of these cartoons. They're fascinating.
Thank you, Kate.
Maybe I can also piggyback on the around 1900, once you start talking about the progressive period. There's a term that historians came up with, which is that women domesticated politics, which is interesting because in the 19th century kind of schema, you would see domestic and political as polar opposites. And as Mark sort of said, that somehow the women could be sort of separate but equal in the domestic sphere. But around 1900, you have women who are increasingly sort of running community centers. People like Jane Addams of Hull House in Chicago, right? She can't vote, but she is doing a lot in this sort of domesticating politics way. She is lobbying for child labor laws, for better garbage collection. She's doing all these very active things, and she becomes one of the most, so she's an Anglo-American, very waspish, but she's sort of one of the most famous women in the United States in the early 20th century. There's a woman, Lillian Wald, I think she probably said Wald and not Wald, who was the daughter of German Jewish immigrants and grew up in Cincinnati. And she runs a big settlement house, one of these big community centers in New York, and she's an important suffragist. So you also, it's interesting how that develops along and kind of weaves in and out of the women's right, the suffrage movement, right? You have women who are sort of like, well, on the one hand, I'm not going to wait until I get the vote. I'm going to kind of keep moving and do the things that I want to do in my community. But those women often tended to be supportive of suffrage. I hate to say about Margareta Schultz, I think that I think it's cool and interesting, and I think it's interesting how she was educated in these educational theories when back in Hamburg, I think.
Correct.
But she didn't really run her kindergarten for terribly long. It was sort of a few neighbors' kids for a few years when she was in Watertown, Wisconsin. So it doesn't really, it's sort of important to look at, but it doesn't really start a movement back when she does it in the 1850s. The kindergarten movement kind of catches on sort of a bit later.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? Sorry.
May I ask a question?
Yes, of course.
I'm Uli Pelz from Sacramento. It strikes me that the term suffrage is usually associated with voting rights. But is there a broader definition for suffrage, right? Maybe Mark can answer that question. Well,
I think suffrage I only interpret as having to do with voting rights, the way that's defined. I mean, the etymology of it does go to suffering, not in the sense of like experiencing pain, but by toleration. It has to do like suffer the children to come to me. I think that's the connection there. So it's like allow. So that's the sense, the original etymological sense. But I think in terms of the way that it's used in English in the 19th and up to the present day, it's basically, I think, just equated with right to vote.
Suffrage comes from the suffering, not from the suffering of, but from the Latin root meaning to express support. And it originally referred to a prayer on behalf of another before evolving into meaning the right to participate equally in the voting process.
Okay.
And that's from, that's the definition I use, and it came out of a Wall Street Journal article actually looking at the etymology of suffragette and suffragist.
Very good. And another question, Mark mentioned Frauenrechte, which is a much broader definition in my view. Refers to not just to voting rights. And Germany was basically a patriarchal society until around the 1970s. The wife had to get permission to accept a job from and to get permission from her husband, also to open a checking account. She had to get permission from her husband, and even in the 1960s. So is that correct? That was my understanding, because I lived in Germany at that time. And that law was changed only in the 1970s. Is that your understanding also?
It's my understanding.
Okay.
It's my understanding in the US for certain. Many women had to have their husband's permission to open a bank account if they were married. We had a lot of, or women didn't have, or women would find out that they, upon divorce in the 70s, had no credit history because all their credit cards, they were the card holder. They were a card holder on their husband's account. So a lot of these issues still work forth to this day and exist in other countries as well.
So
I mean, there's lots of these holdover laws all the way up through. And for that matter, I mean, we need to be very clear about this. Because of time constraints, we're stopping at the 19th Amendment in 1920. Mm-hmm. But if you'll bear with me for 1 second, the just because the 19th Amendment passed, it only enfranchised a few women. You had 1924, the Indian Citizenship Act. Native Americans deemed U.S. citizens, but states continue to decide who votes. 1943, you had the Magnuson Act. Chinese Americans were granted the right to become citizens and therefore could vote. So there were Chinese women, women of Chinese descent, of Asian, who advocated, were suffragists, but could not vote. 1962, Utah is the last state to enfranchise Native Americans. And then you have, of course, the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which was African Americans and Native Americans who continue to face exclusion. Now we have it in different ways. Now the voter suppression happens in different ways. But it's, I mean, the 19th Amendment was in some respects an end, but a beginning for the next stage, because of the splintering between that era, between the 1860s and the late 1860s and 1920.
Well,
I'm really glad that you're I'm really glad that you're emphasizing that, Kate. I think it's important to, I mean, there were sort of millions of women who could actually vote before the 19th Amendment, and then millions of women who couldn't vote after the 19th Amendment. One little tidbit that I was kind of hoping that I would have the chance to share was that there was an African-American woman, you maybe heard of her, Mary Church Terrell. She was reasonably famous around 1900. She was one of the founders of the NAACP, and she's active in women's suffrage. But interestingly, she has a German connection. She learned German, and she spent time in Europe. And she went to a women's rights convention in Berlin in 1904 and presented her speech in German and in English and in French. And apparently, I don't know if there's anyone out here who wants kind of to do some volunteer work, but apparently there are German language papers from Mary Church Terrell that have been digitized by the Library of Congress that need transcribing. So she's a very interesting figure. I would like to see more research on the German side of her career.
What did the ERA have in common with the women's suffrage movement? Because I mean that wasn't ratified, and I always thought that was a women's issue as well, the Equal Rights Amendment.
It was actually right after the 19th Amendment passed. They began, the National Women's Party and Alice Paul's group began to push for an ERA. And if you look on the timeline, I'm trying to pull up the timeline right now. You know, it's still outstanding. So the last state ratified, the last state necessary for ratification happened recently, but now we're up against a legal conundrum of the clock ran out. So I'm not sure how that will be moving forward. But there is a strong connection for it. And there's talk back much further. I mean, there was discussion of an Equal Rights Amendment before 1920. Mm-hmm. Then the main National Women's Party that Alison referred to, which was, so you have the split in 1869 after the 15th Amendment, and then you form the NWSA and the AWSA, and that's split over the 15th Amendment. So the National Women's Suffrage Association and the American Women's Suffrage Association. Then Susan B. Anthony unites them in 1890 to become the National American Women's Suffrage Association. After the 19th Amendment, that becomes the League of Women Voters.
Interesting.
I'm curious whether Mark has any, oh, Mark just dropped off my screen, but
I'm still here.
okay, I'm interested. I have found this to be a conundrum in my own research, and also I think when I talk to people today, to sort of how to think about the relative patriarchy, or to think about different gender systems in different countries, because I do feel, and sort of comparing it to my to New Zealand, I do think there are differences. Often it's hard for me to say that one's kind of ahead and one's behind, but that linear thinking doesn't always capture it for me. But I would say I know female colleagues in German universities, it seems like in some ways their things are more challenging for them than they are for women in US universities. But
Yeah.
Listen, I would take it one step further and say it's challenging depending on where you live in the United States, because it varies on what kind of communities you live in and the populations and the experiences in those communities culturally. That certainly plays out across if you look at the ratification process.
I think it would be interesting to look at women in the professions generally. I mean, I know academia well because that is my profession, but my hunch is that there are very fewer women in positions of leadership across the board still today in Germany, despite the fact that the social net is better and support for families and kids and, you know, education and healthcare and that sort of thing is still, there's this lingering, you know, feeling that women should be home at lunch for their kids when they come home from school kind of thing. And if the mom is not there, then grandma's got to be there kind of thing. It's just, there's this word Rabenmutter, raven mother, which is basically means like a mother who's abandoning her children. That's still a strong, you know, kind of thing. But of course, you know, the balancing of career and family obligations is something that's it's not just a uniquely German or European thing. It's something that's kind of widespread here too. But it's, I mean, to Germany's, just speaking specifically of Germany and Switzerland for that matter too, to their credit, I mean, things have improved dramatically in the last, certainly generation, but I would say in terms of like, you know, really, you know, like job advertisements, they're saying specifically women are encouraged to apply. And, you know, making things much more, and not just simply saying apply, but also hired and then making things, you know, viable for, say, dual career people. So it's like where both spouses are employed. But yeah, it's a, I don't know, it's a double-edged sword. I mean, I still look longingly to social democracies because of the social net. Not thinking so much about the cultural differences, but just like I say, man, boy, you know, to have, you know, universal health care and, you know, free education and, you know, decent road maintenance and all these kinds of things.
Well, thanks.
Alison, I don't know if it, oh, go ahead. Alison, I don't know if it's relevant, but sorry, Katja, but when I was in Germany in the 90s, and my friends of my age would talk about how the school system was literally prevented them from really taking their place in the work world because of this come home in the middle of the afternoon, then go back, this split that we didn't have in the US. But again, I think it depends on the issue you look at. In some respects, they're farther ahead, and in some respects, we have different, it's very uneven, I think.
Absolutely. Well, I think that concludes our session today, and I want to thank everybody, particularly you, Alison, Kate, and Mark, for giving us your wonderful insights, for sharing your knowledge with us. Thank you so very much. Thank you to all of you who took time out of their day, wherever you are, whether on the East Coast, in the Midwest, on the West Coast, or perhaps even in another country, that you joined us. And I hope it was insightful. I certainly learned a lot. And this is going to be an ongoing journey for me as well. And I'm actually going to look into the Mary Church Terrell papers, Alison, and since I'm here in Washington, D.C., and the Library of Congress is just around the corner down 6th Street and on Constitution Avenue, I might actually see if I can help out. I do speak, read, and write fluent German, so I could help there. So perhaps, but thank you everybody for joining us virtually, and I think it worked very well. Technology did not abandon us. It's lasted, the signal's been solid, and thank you so much again. Have a wonderful rest of your day or your evening, wherever you are. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Katja.
Thank you.
Bye.
Great job.
Thank
Everybody,
you.
thank
Take
you.
care. All the best.